Breaking tonight, Australia's sovereignty strategy just accelerated dramatically. Canberra didn't blink, they doubled down. Tensions are escalating in the Indo-Pacific tonight. China issued open-ended threats over Australian infrastructure, but instead of diplomatic retreat, Canberra reinforced national security commitments. Everyone believed Australia would negotiate quietly with Beijing to avoid trade retaliation. Financial analysts expected Canberra to delay Port of Darwin action indefinitely. Regional observers assumed Australia would prioritize the $390 billion trade relationship over strategic autonomy. They were all utterly incorrect. Canberra, January 30th, 2026. Standing before national media, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese made a statement that reverberated through Beijing. If sovereignty is threatened, Australia will not compromise. We are committed to making sure that port goes back into Australian hands because that is in our national interest. Translation: Canberra just told Beijing that Australian strategic independence is non-negotiable. And what happened next? The nation that refused to sacrifice security for commerce reveals exactly why Australian resolve is reshaping Indo-Pacific power dynamics while Chinese economic coercion collapses. Dear viewers, between January 2025 and January 2026, something extraordinary happened in Australia-China strategic relationships. Beijing threatened too explicitly. Canberra said no. And Australia, professional, patient Australia, became the example every middle power started watching closely. This isn't just about one disputed infrastructure lease. This is about the fundamental collapse of economic intimidation as a strategy and the rise of sovereign determination as the new currency of influence in the Indo-Pacific. The context everyone missed here is what actually transpired in Darwin over the past decade that made January 30th inevitable. The Port of Darwin sits at the apex of Australia's northern strategic frontier, critical maritime infrastructure, defense force staging area, agricultural export gateway, energy industry lifeline. In 2015, under a coalition government decision, this vital national asset was leased to China's Landbridge group for 99 years. Not 5 years, not 10 years. 99 years of foreign control over infrastructure that touches every pillar of Australia's northern economy. The company's connections, strong ties to the Chinese Communist Party. The security implications, immediate and escalating. The strategic vulnerability, obvious to anyone examining Indo-Pacific military positioning. Northern Territory Chief Minister Finocchiaro stated the situation plainly on January 30th. We want to make sure that we're delivering certainty for the staff that work at the port, for people who utilize that facility, and for growth into the future. We've got big plans for that precinct where we're building a fantastic shiplift, which is going to really boost our maritime industry and support the key pillars of our economy around defense and agriculture and energy. Notice what she emphasized. Defense, agriculture, energy, the three sectors where Chinese government influence over Australian infrastructure creates maximum strategic risk. She continued, so this really needs to be done. Time is ticking, and we just urge the federal government to deliver on this commitment for the people of the Northern Territory, because 9 months on this still remains an uncertainty that I'd like put to bed. 9 months. That's how long Australia has been navigating Chinese pressure since Albanese's 2025 election promise to reclaim the port, and Beijing's response, not diplomatic negotiation, not commercial discussion. Open-ended threats delivered directly through official channels. The threat that revealed everything Chinese ambassador to Australia Xiao Qian made his position clear this week at the Chinese embassy, and his language choice was remarkably revealing. First, he framed the lease as purely commercial. This is business between a Chinese company and the Australian government that was reached on the basis of market rules. Market rules, as if a 99-year lease of critical defense infrastructure follows the same commercial principles as office space rental. Then came the veiled threat the Chinese government has an obligation to protect the legitimate interest of Chinese companies overseas. So if anything happens, like the port will be taken back by force or forceful measures, then we have an obligation to take measures to protect the Chinese company's interest. Notice the careful ambiguity. Forceful measures undefined. Obligation to take measures unspecified. Maximum intimidation value with minimum diplomatic accountability. When pressed on what specific counteraction Australia could expect, Ambassador Zhao kept options deliberately vague, stating a resolution was not yet clear. But he did float that any Australian moves could hurt trade and investment from China. There it is, the economic coercion playbook distilled into one sentence. Australia's largest trading partner, with two-way trade totaling $309 billion in 2024-25, issuing implicit threats about commercial retaliation if Canberra pursues national security priorities. Translation: Beijing expects Australia to prioritize Chinese commercial interests over Australian strategic sovereignty. The response that changed everything: Prime Minister Albanese's reaction to Chinese threats came within hours, at a press conference where he didn't soften language or hedge commitments. We've made it very clear that we want the Port of Darwin that was sold to non-Australian interests with a financial incentive from the former coalition government to the Northern Territory government. That wasn't something that we supported at the time, and we are committed to making sure that that port goes back into Australian hands because that is in our national interest. Three critical elements in that statement. First, he explicitly blamed the coalition government for creating this vulnerability with financial incentives to the Northern Territory. Political accountability for strategic mistakes. Second, he referenced Labor's consistent opposition since 2015. This isn't opportunistic positioning, it's decade-long policy continuity. Third, and most importantly, he anchored the decision in national interest, not commercial calculation. When a prime minister explicitly states national interest supersedes trade relationships worth $309 billion annually, that's not diplomatic rhetoric. That's strategic doctrine. The method everyone underestimated here is where Canberra's approach becomes genuinely sophisticated. In making his 2025 election promise, Albanese outlined both private and public pathways to reclaim the port. The preferred method, giving the lease to a private Australian firm with superannuation funds specifically mentioned as potential buyers. If private acquisition proves impossible, Commonwealth intervention directly. This two-track strategy accomplishes something brilliant. It allows commercial negotiation while maintaining government leverage. Landbridge can negotiate with Australian private sector interests, knowing government acquisition remains the alternative option. Infrastructure Minister Catherine King confirmed late last year that sensitive talks with Landbridge were underway. We're having constructive discussions with Landbridge, and really, I'm not going to comment further on the Port of Darwin acquisition at this time. The Commonwealth's made it clear what it wants to do, and we won't comment further at this time. Constructive discussions. That's diplomatic language for serious negotiation under pressure. Meanwhile, Landbridge publicly states the port is not for sale. Classic negotiation positioning. Declare your asset unavailable while privately exploring terms that might change that position. The pattern Beijing refuses to recognize this Port of Darwin confrontation represents something larger than one infrastructure dispute. It reveals the fundamental shift in how middle powers are responding to economic coercion. The old playbook assumed smaller economies would always prioritize trade access over strategic autonomy. Beijing threatens commercial retaliation. Canberra retreats on security policy. Business continues as usual. But that calculation no longer holds across the Indo-Pacific. Australia watched what happened when China imposed trade restrictions on Australian exports from 2020 to 2024. Wine, barley, beef, coal billions in trade disrupted to punish Canberra for requesting COVID-19 origin investigations. The result: Australian exporters diversified markets. Alternative buyers emerged. China eventually removed most restrictions between 2023 and 2024 because they needed Australian resources more than Australia needed Chinese market access on Beijing's terms. That experience taught Canberra something critical: short-term trade pain creates long-term strategic resilience. Now apply that lesson to the Port of Darwin. Yes, China could theoretically retaliate against the $309 billion trade relationship, but at what cost to Chinese access to Australian iron ore, natural gas, and agricultural products? Beijing's leverage is more limited than Ambassador Zhao's threats suggest. What happens next? Chief Minister Finocchiaro's call for urgency reflects genuine economic concerns. The Northern Territory is building a major shiplift facility that depends on port certainty. Maritime industry expansion, defense contracting, agricultural exports, energy development, all waiting for resolution. We've got big plans for that precinct, she stated. Those plans require knowing who controls the infrastructure they depend on. The federal government now faces three scenarios. Scenario 1, private Australian acquisition succeeds. Landbridge negotiates exit terms with Australian superannuation funds or infrastructure investors. Beijing saves face by characterizing it as commercial transaction. Australia regains control without direct confrontation. Scenario 2, private acquisition fails. Commonwealth exercises compulsory acquisition powers. Beijing protests loudly. Short-term diplomatic tension. Long-term strategic security. Scenario 3, negotiation stalemate extends indefinitely. Uncertainty continues. Northern Territory development stalls. Political pressure on Albanese intensifies. The timeline matters here. Albanese made this commitment in 2025. It's now January 2026. 9 months of sensitive discussions with no public resolution. At some point, either private negotiation succeeds or government intervention becomes necessary. The middle option, permanent uncertainty, serves nobody's interests. The larger implication, what we're witnessing in Darwin, is the test case for whether economic interdependence still constrains sovereign decision-making in the Indo-Pacific. China's approach assumes Australia will calculate trade value above strategic autonomy. Ambassador Xiao's threats rely on that assumption holding firm. Australia's response suggests that calculation has fundamentally shifted. When your largest trading partner explicitly threatens retaliation over national security decisions, that's not a partnership, that's dependence. And Canberra, backed by Northern Territory leadership and Australian public opinion, is choosing autonomy over dependence. The pattern was identical across every conversation between Australian and Chinese officials. Beijing would reference commercial relationships, express concern about Landbridge's legitimate interests, and imply trade consequences. Canberra's answer remained consistent: national interest is non-negotiable. The question everyone should be asking: if China's $309 billion trade relationship can't prevent Australia from reclaiming strategic infrastructure, what does that tell every other Indo-Pacific nation watching this confrontation? It reveals that economic coercion has limits. That middle powers with diversified trade relationships and strong alliances can resist pressure. That sovereignty decisions ultimately outweigh commercial calculations when security is at stake. Beijing issued threats. Canberra doubled down, and the port that represents everything about Indo-Pacific strategic competition is returning to Australian control, not because diplomacy softened Chinese objections, but because Australian resolve proved stronger than Chinese leverage. This isn't just about Darwin. This is about whether economic interdependence enables partnership or creates vulnerability. And Australia, professional, patient Australia, just provided the answer that every threatened nation was waiting to hear. The port is coming home, and no amount of trade threats will change that outcome. If you want to understand how middle powers are reshaping Indo-Pacific power dynamics, subscribe now. We're covering every development as Australia demonstrates that sovereignty isn't negotiable regardless of who's buying.